Well, since you mentioned it, let's move on to Obama's final State of the Union last night. He called for civility and even called for a cure for cancer. Josh, what'd you make of the president's one last State of the Union?
I don't know. I always was a sucker for lofty calls to unity, whether it's any side. I did a story once about this Republican guy who sat down and gave a speech. His first speech in Congress was about fixing politics. So again, that's a message that I think to anyone who pays attention is appealing. What I do think is interesting is that it is still that it falls on deaf ears. That immediately there were people saying that it was divisive. Saying that. What was the thing that was really pissing people off last night? The climate change dig. I think when he talked about climate change, and then when he talked about Osama bin Laden, they didn't like that, and it's just interesting that I wonder if while the message may have been good, he's just become too controversial to ever deliver that, which is ironic considering that was his original sort of goal. He was going to be like, Black Lincoln coming into Washington and bringing a team of rivals together and fixing everything. And what we got was what we got.
Eric, what would you have liked to have heard from Obama last night that we didn't?
I'm not sure, actually. I think he touched on all the points as you would expect. I mean, he had it right down to his typical humor that he likes to throw in, joking about the Iowa caucuses coming up and how different candidates were eager to rush off for the campaign. I think he touched on the economy in a way, suggesting that it has grown since he's taken office. He touched on the war a little bit. I mean, there's always a few details in that, but maybe not as much as he should have, as we were mentioning before. I think overall, he hit the points correctly, but as Josh was saying, there's always going to be party lines, and no matter what he said, the Republicans are always going to find something bad in it, and the Democrats are always going to say it's not enough. And that's the issue, is that people are going to turn it into a divisive speech no matter what.
Well, I mean, that's all very disingenuous. They all stood up and applauded when he called for an end to gerrymandering and for more civility. But who's responsible for all the gerrymandering?
They have to, right? Because it's their leader giving the speech. But I mean, later on, they'll pick points out of it that they didn't like and say, "Oh, well, I don't think he went far enough on this." Just like the Republicans will say, "He went too far on this." There's always going to be critics that are going to pick it apart.
Now, Peter, you mentioned Afghanistan. Is there anything else you would have liked to have heard from Obama in his one last address to the nation?
I think overall I would have liked to have heard a lot more specifics. I mean, that would have been a hell of a speech in 2009. And parts of it sounded like some hell of a speeches we heard from him in the campaign in 2008. But after 7 years in office, I would have liked to have heard him say things a little more specific than, we need to close Guantanamo. Exactly whose job has that been for the last 7 years? Divisiveness, true, but he threw in enough snark about, especially Trump, as well as some of the Republican candidates and their penchant for carpet bombing, that he was sort of contradicting himself even as we went.
There you go. Everyone just kind of disappeared on me, but I can still hear you.
Same with you guys.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me just carry on a little bit, and whenever you guys, there's Igor back. So I mean, the same thing. I don't recall him saying a whole lot about gun control. And yet he had made a featured speech about that, and this is an issue that plagues all Americans. We heard a lot of things about income inequality, but not a lot of specifics on that. Every president takes credit when the economy is good, and every president says it's not his fault when the economy is bad. Obama talked about the Great Recession as if it was some historical artifact, when in fact it was his administration that handled the giant bailouts of the Wall Street firms and didn't pursue the prosecutions because they were all too big to fail, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea that he didn't take any responsibility for that, that he chose to completely ignore things that just were not, happy, comfortable stuff, and that he talked about issues like Guantanamo almost in the third person, really left me a little saddened. I also, just on a personal level, am really sick to death of that whole folksy thing that he does. He slipped in and out of it. In some points, he was doing the preacher thing he likes to do sometimes. He was big on that during the campaign. There are things we need to do. We need to stand up and say to the world, we are not afraid as America. He does that. And then he'll do the, Igor, there are so many things. Now, I know folks out there don't always agree with Igor. Well, they don't always agree with me. But as a nation, he does that. And I think it felt a little old.
Speech telling.
Sorry?
I would argue that's proper speech telling, with the added pauses, emphasis, and stuff.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, the Guantanamo mention really.
That's sort of my point, is that it's. I just think it's Obama himself. That people feel strongly about him one way or another, or both ways on different things, but he becomes the issue no matter what the issue is, and I guess that's kind of what happens with any two-term president in his last year. I remember, Bush was basically persona non grata in his final year in office because of how, badly the wars seemed to be going, and the fact that the economy seemed headed towards collapse. It was a sort of similar circumstance, except Bush is able to pull off the charisma thing a little better, the folksy charisma that Obama doesn't have.